Contenuto di una certa importanza oggi, contenuto particolare, contenuto di cui vado particolarmente orgoglioso e ringrazio AMD per l'opportunità che mi è stata data e AMD Italia, insomma, per avermi supportato in questa avventura. Ragazzi, sono riuscito a parlare direttamente con AMD per tutto ciò che riguarda la 3D Cache che verrà ospitata nei Ryzen 7950X e 7900X che stanno uscendo in questo momento e ovviamente più avanti anche nel Ryzen 7 7800X, tutti quanti in versione 3D. Abbiamo parlato di tante cose, abbiamo fatto diverse domande, qualcuna magari anche un pochettino pungente, giusto per cercare di capire qualche segreto in più. Ovviamente da queste CPU AMD cosa ci aspetta? Sicuramente un grosso aumento di performance per quello che riguarda il gaming, si parla comunque di numeri tra il 15 e il 20% negli ambiti in cui la cache viene utilizzata enormemente. Parliamo comunque insomma di un uplift non indifferente anche per chi passa da un processore di serie precedente a un 7000. Soprattutto parliamo anche di disponibilità dei pezzi appunto di nuova generazione, quindi parliamo di schede madri B650, X670, del fatto che le DDR5 stiano scendendo di prezzo e quindi comunque farsi una piattaforma del genere è diventato un po' più semplice e che comunque al momento la miglior CPU da gaming per tirare fuori fino all'ultimo FPS è sicuramente quella AMD, ma a quanto pare arriveranno molto presto novità anche per ambiti che non riguardano il gaming, che è una notizia che mi fa molto contento. Comunque adesso insomma vi lascio un attimo all'intervista e poi ogni tanto vi intermezzo con le domande in italiano. L'intervista è stata fatta in inglese, non vi preoccupate, ci sono i sottotitoli, abbiamo cercato di farli al meglio delle nostre possibilità nel poco tempo che abbiamo avuto. Spero che comunque il video per voi sia particolarmente godibile.
All right, first of all, nice to meet you, Gianmarco, and thank you for showing interest and making time for us today.
So today we're gonna start talk about 3D cache. It's something in Italy we only see like on the gaming side, but we don't know specifically the secrets of the 3D cache.
Secrets. All right, so maybe I can share a few secrets of what 3D Vcache is. I think basic explanation is obviously with our Ryzen CPUs. You may have known that in Computex 2021, we started to announce 3D Vcache as a technology. And then in 2022, we brought it out with the Ryzen 7 5800 X3D. Huge success at the time, the fastest CPU for gaming. So we were very excited what 3D Vcache could mean for gamers. With the introduction of our new AM5 platform, leading in terms of technology with PCIe Gen 5, DDR5, it only made sense for us to continue the 3D Vcache story, obviously, there as well. Awesome new products coming up, Ryzen 7000 series with 3D Vcache, 3 new models, the Ryzen 9 7950 X3D, up to 16 cores, and then the Ryzen 9 7900 X3D, up to 12 cores. Those are the first Ryzen 9s with 3D Vcache. And then last but not least, obviously, coming in April, our Ryzen 7 7800 X3D, 8 cores with 3D Vcache. So basically the follow-up product to the Ryzen 7 5800 X3D. Now, what makes 3D Vcache products different from regular Ryzen or Ryzen 7000 series CPU in this case? There's obviously 3 key elements to a Ryzen CPU with 3D Vcache. One is obviously Zen 3 cores or Zen 4 cores when we talk about Ryzen 7000 series. Then we have AMD's 3D Vcache or hybrid bond, what we do to increase the L3 cache on the chip. That's a separate chip basically. We use hybrid bonding to connect those. And there is obviously 3D Vcache structural die, that's a separate die as I mentioned, as part of that chip. So basically 3 ingredients to make the Ryzen 7000 3D Vcache products. I actually have something that I brought, if you don't mind me showing on camera.
No.
This is the regular Ryzen 7000 box.
Yes.
And I think it's already really cool looking. But this is the spectacular Ryzen 7000 with 3D Vcache. So
that's a huge box.
It will stand out, right? In the market.
Yes. Una delle prime cose che comunque ho voluto chiedere è prima di tutto quali erano i componenti chiave della 3D Cache e un pochettino in che modo interagisse con la totalità del processore per darci appunto questo aumento di performance.
It's basically additional 64 megabytes of L3 cache allowed because of the die thinning what we do. So I have a CPU right here. This is the 7900X, right?
Yes.
And if you look at the CPU underneath basically the lid, what you see here is usually the CPU dies, right? You probably know that. And so what we've done is on top of that die, underneath the lid, we've added additional 3D V cache, 64 megabytes of it in a separate die. But to keep the same Z height, the height for the dies, and cooler compatibility, for example, we had to basically grind it down. Die thinning is what that is called, to make sure that you can use the same coolers, use it basically as an upgrade path on AM5 if you have an already existing 7000X CPU or 7000 non-X, like the 65 watt models. You can still upgrade later with it without having to change the cooler or the motherboard, for example. And so with 3D V cache added, we see significant performance improvement, especially in games, because we closely work with game developers as well, over non-3D V cache products. So Ryzen 7000, let's say the 7950X, is already a great product, right? It's shown a very, very top gaming performance, and it's shown one of the best in productivity at the same time. So there is a let's say, user base for those products for sure, especially for those that do not only game on their system, for example. If you're into gaming and that is the most thing you do on your system, you would always want a 3D V cache CPU because it delivers more performance in those games. Still, it has the opportunity to do great productivity workload as well because of the basis, which is the Zen 4 architecture. It is still the same with a 3D V cache CPU as a non-3D V cache CPU. So you get the same IPC uplift up to 29%. So basically best of both worlds really with 3D V cache. And then if you compare that to the Ryzen 7 5800X3D with also 3D V cache, it's largely the same technology, that the way that we used it. There are slight differences to make it compatible with the Ryzen 7000 series because of the different structure that the Zen 4 CPU has over Zen 3. But largely it's the same compared to the Ryzen 7 5800X3D as well.
Non essendo il primo processore AMD 3D cache, abbiamo già avuto il 5800X 3D, ho voluto anche chiedere appunto quali fossero le maggiori differenze tra quel tipo di tecnologia e invece appunto questa odierna.
So with every 3D V cache product out today and coming on February 28th, we'll have 7 nanometer for the 3D V cache die, same as on 5800X3D. But the small changes are within the firmware, and as I mentioned, the hybrid bond to make that stick to the Ryzen 7000 CPU die or CCD. And that's really the only change compared to the Ryzen 7 5800X3D. So it's still, the process node is still 7 nanometer in that sense.
Perfect.
But obviously the Ryzen 7000 CPU dies or the CCDs are all 5 nanometer, right?
Yes. So it's like basically something with the old generation of Ryzen, like it's something hybrid, some with lithography and some without lithography.
Yes, exactly.
Like we say in Italy, the team that wins will not change.
Yeah, exactly. Don't change the winning formula. That's what we say. Yeah, absolutely.
Ho provato a chiedere se oltre la latenza ci fosse qualche altro segreto, qualche altra piccola magia. Ho provato insomma a farmi dire qualcosa che non potevano dirmi, però comunque la risposta è stata soddisfacente.
Well, with 3D V cache, obviously AMD technology involves the die thinning, as I mentioned, to make sure it fits. It's not something that everybody can just do simply
Yes.
because of that. Also, the hybrid bonding is a very special technique that needs to be implemented to make sure that this fits. And then your question about, latency improvements. Let me start off with the general 3D V cache benefit. Obviously, you may have seen one of our videos back in the day when we launched Ryzen 7 5800X3D with Robert Halleck, for example, explaining, the time taken for a frame to render by a certain amount of time, right? Or the latency that it takes. And that comparison with 3D V cache is like this, and then with RAM, like your system memory,
Yes.
is like 10x, right? And so that's really the huge benefit that you get from, especially games, being able to load requests into the CPU directly from the cache, getting those instructions, getting those requests sent back for data. That really improves the gaming performance. And as we work closely with those game developers, as mentioned, taking more benefits of that increased size in L3 cache, we are definitely seeing a lot more performance coming in terms of FPS, basically, where your CPU could be in certain scenarios a bottleneck, for example, right? To talk more about, is there something else really, contributing to that increase in, let's say, performance or lower latency. It's really all down to just having that whopping 64 megabytes of L3 cache. So it's really the amount of memory that we're able to cram in that same CPU on top of that CCD that really makes that a completely different product when you compare it to other CPUs for gaming, for example.
Domanda più importante, appunto, per ciò che riguarda le RAM. Questa qui magari è una notizia che potrebbe far comodo a molti per chi vuole assemblare, una notizia effettivamente utile. Praticamente, insomma, con questa riduzione così drastica della latenza ho voluto informare sul fatto se gli AMD 3D avessero quindi bisogno di RAM veramente stracostose e veramente veloci per poter girare bene. Posta devo dire che penso che a qualcuno farà piacere.
I think in general, as you may have seen from previous generation Ryzen and Threadripper products, especially when we move to chiplet architecture, you can see users being rewarded with better performance if they pair it with at least, let's say, decent performing RAM in terms of frequency and low latency, right? So there's always some kind of sweet spot, especially since we've introduced Infinity Fabric and so on. You want to be as close as possible to that coupled mode, so one-to-one U-clock, mem-clock situation. And in the case of the Ryzen 3000 series, that was like 3600, let's say CL16, CL14 memory. 5000 series, very similar because that was still on the AM4 socket. But now, as we've moved to AM5, you can see, for example, DDR5 6000 with low cache latency, like 30, 32. That would really benefit and show you higher performance when you play your games, as it's just more optimized to utilize Ryzen Zen 4, and now on top of that 3D V cache as well. So there's definitely sweet spots to go after for your memory. If you're looking at price performance, then maybe 5600 would be okay in your region, depending on where you purchase, what the price is. But in general, we'd say staying as close as possible to the 1-to-1 ratio for the Infinity Fabric will definitely benefit you with and reward you with more performance.
Because right now also DDR5 it's getting cheaper, so I think that's a huge point to enter in this new technology. I also notice a huge improvement. I don't saw the improvements before when I first test, but right now I'm running a 750X with DDR5. I'm currently on 6400 RAM, and I think it's a big improvement from what I had. Abbiamo parlato ovviamente anche del fatto che la cache è al momento uno strumento che per alcuni ambiti di sviluppo è ancora invisibile, proprio gli sviluppatori non riescono ad ottenere informazioni, se ci saranno sviluppi, soprattutto per quanto riguarda l'intelligenza artificiale, che al momento è una delle maggiori applicazioni, a parte che di utilizzo, che ChatGPT ormai l'abbiamo sentito in tutte le salse, ma soprattutto che ha bisogno appunto di tanta memoria per funzionare, e soprattutto che in quel caso la latenza potrebbe andarci ad aiutare, visto che comunque vediamo come già operazioni di deep learning e machine learning vanno a disintegrare letteralmente le VRAM di una scheda video. Se la 3D cache in questo caso può andare.
I mean, you touched on something very interesting, AI, which is a very interesting area for sure. As AMD has developed this technology with 3D V-cache and introduced that with, let's say, consumer products, enabling that technology with more L3 cache at your disposal, developers now have the freedom of choice to start developing their tools, their applications and so on, to be fully utilizing that, high level of L3 cache. And really what game developers are already doing, right? Benefiting from that and seeing that as a result in higher frame rates. There's definitely opportunities now for other programs and productivity tasks or content creation tasks to start benefiting from that as well. And so it's always beneficial, I guess, if your software is optimized to benefit from, let's say, the more direct L3 cache coming straight from the CPU, rather than having to wait for the RAM, like as we mentioned earlier. So it's all wait and let's see for how this continues to develop. But we see a strong performance increase on the gaming side. Let's see what the developers can do with that as well.
Altro argomento importante che è stato trattato è appunto dove risiede questa 3D cache. Sappiamo che praticamente questa 3D cache risiede soltanto su un CCD. Questo qui praticamente ti permette di avere 8 core, diciamo, ad alta efficienza gaming, ad alta latenza, e 8 core invece in più che vanno a sviluppare praticamente tutta la performance dei 16 core, per avere un ambiente multithreading molto, molto potente. Diciamo che in qualche modo rende il processore ibrido di AMD, ma allo stesso modo completo e unito. È una soluzione molto interessante, diciamo.
No, so yeah, you're right. In terms of the Ryzen 9 parts, they have two CCDs. One CCD is stacked with 3D VCAS, as I mentioned, and the other one is not stacked. I mean, this configuration, as I mentioned before, gives users like yourself best of both world scenarios. So when you're gaming, you can take advantage of the 8 cores with 3D VCache and have the best of the best gaming experience that the current hardware can offer you, right? And then on the side, if you do content creation or productivity workloads, you want to make sure that you have 16 cores at your disposal. You want to have as high frequency as possible, let's say in single-threaded, lightly threaded, but especially in multi-threaded applications. And so that's where the other CCD without 3D V-Cache really gives you a lot of productivity performance as well. So I guess having that is a perfect balance in what end users are looking for in terms of if you're an enthusiast playing your games, but also do content creation on the side. If you're a streamer like yourself or a YouTuber, you record videos, you want to have, while you're playing, minimal impact on your frame rate, which is why, the one CCD with 3D V-Cache can be fully utilized for the game that you're playing, and you have so much more headroom left and so many more cores left to perform background tasks, for example. And that's where, let's say, the non-3D V-Cache CCD comes in, where it's fully optimized to deliver just that on the side.
Ed ovviamente una delle cose più importanti è, abbiamo visto appunto Ryzen 9, Ryzen 7, i budget gamer, le persone che magari vogliono cercare un Ryzen 5, se avranno la possibilità di ottenere ben presto un processore del genere.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Gianmarco, I cannot comment on any unannounced or unreleased products, as you may know. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting question for sure. So yeah, I can imagine how our fans and people looking for upgrades, may look at the 3D V-Cache products. But yeah, I unfortunately cannot comment
Okay,
on any
no.
unannounced products.
Don't
So
worry, don't
sorry.
worry. Thank you,
Yeah.
thank you for your honesty. Una cosa molto importante che ho cercato di chiarire è appunto come lo scheduler della CPU e del sistema operativo andasse poi a interagire con questi core, cioè come facciamo effettivamente a sapere questi sono core con la 3D cache, questi sono i core della 3D cache, usiamoli per questo, questo e quest'altro. Diciamo la risposta è stata che comunque loro stanno interagendo appunto con Microsoft Windows, hanno una partnership molto stretta, ma non soltanto con Microsoft, ma anche insomma con molti sviluppatori di videogiochi, e non solo, di conseguenza insomma dipende un pochettino anche da loro. Però diciamo che comunque il loro approccio finora è stato positivo e credono soltanto che continuerà a migliorare.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, whenever we launched Ryzen and Threadripper with chiplet architecture, when AMD launched that, then we also had to obviously work closely with Microsoft, for example, to make sure that it's well implemented in the OS, making sure that it works well, but it also delivers optimal performance, right? And that's the goal. And especially with 3D V-Cache, it's very important. So nothing has changed in terms of our approach, right? As I mentioned in the technology way, but we've started to work even more closely with Microsoft, always making sure that each generation we are maximizing the performance from the 3D V-Cache products. And that's exactly what we've done this time, making sure that Microsoft Windows 10 and 11 are ready for a Ryzen 7000 with 3D V-Cache, but also a large part of our focus is to continue to focus with game developers on how we can further improve their titles, making sure that they fully benefit from 3D V-Cache, being able to get even higher frame rates, right? And that's really has always been our focus, and making sure that the right cores and threads are aligned and are allocated when you start playing games. So there's obviously a lot of things going on in the background with software, with hardware designs, optimizations. Just a couple of things to mention. Motherboard BIOSes, for example, they need to be optimized for 3D V-Cache. But also AMD chipset drivers, they need to be optimized for 3D V-Cache in correlation with the OS, with the right version of the OS, being able to enable the full performance benefit of having 3D V-Cache CPU. So our approach in a way hasn't really changed ever since AMD introduced the chiplet architecture. It's just focusing more on optimizing more for complete utilization and maximum performance out of these CPUs.
Perfect. So right now you say Microsoft, Windows, and etc. Right now I am a Linux user. It works great. It works great.
Okay, great to hear.
Do you have some plan also for it, or you like happy how it runs, and it runs a lot?
Well, it's first of all, it's great to hear your feedback, and I appreciate you sharing that. Myself, I'm not a Linux user, so I take your word. If you're saying it's running great, I'm perfectly happy. And then obviously, if we have any plans on Linux, I can definitely check that for you and come back with an answer once I spoke to one of our engineers, for example, whether it's the software side or the hardware side. I can definitely check that and come back to you later after this call.
Ovviamente, essendo questo processo qualcosa che va ad impilare sui core praticamente un altro strato, nonostante diciamo il loro die-fining, cioè nel senso proprio il loro proprio assottigliare il die per fare in modo insomma che tutte le superfici toccassero bene, se appunto ci fosse modalità, cioè ci fosse modo di avere dei problemi per quanto riguarda temperature e consumi, e in realtà a quanto pare avremo processori che avranno un TDP più basso, quindi di conseguenza dovrebbero avere anche delle temperature migliori.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So let me first start off with basically with the introduction of 3D V-Cache in 7000 series. We feel like now we have processors that really speak to the majority of the enthusiast, DIYer, or folks that are just into gaming / content creation on the side. So you have the best of the best gaming CPUs, or the fastest gaming CPUs on the planet, with Ryzen 7000 with 3D V-Cache. Then in the middle, you have the Ryzen 7000X series products, the one you are currently using. Best of both worlds in terms of great gaming performance, but also the best in productivity. And then for people that want to jump on the latest and greatest in technology, and the AM5 platform obviously offering DDR5 with more memory bandwidth, higher frequency, but also PCIe 5 for future NVMe devices or potential graphics cards, right? We also introduced the Ryzen 7000 65-watt models, as you may know, the non-X versions of that with even higher value. So we included coolers with that. So making that price delta over the AM4 smaller again. And as you mentioned, as DDR5 pricing is coming down, it's a really interesting time to consider upgrading to AM5 today. And with that, 3 different CPUs to choose from now in 7000 series, I think we have a really, really great offering for any tech enthusiast or gamer out there today. But circling back to your question, how does 3D V-Cache impact in terms of temperature? Today you see the Ryzen 7000 series with 3D V-Cache have an official TDP of 120 watts instead of 170 watts, right? For, let's say, the 7950X or the 7900X. This is by design. So with that reduced TDP, we do see that many third-party coolers, for example, can still be used for the same CPU as you come from a 5000 series CPU. An AM4 compatible cooler will work on the AM5 as well. And this has also been part of our strategy, right? To make sure that anybody who's upgrading does not need to upgrade all those separate components all the time. So I think it's a great showing having 120 watts TDP in such a great gaming processor. And that's basically by design. So compatibility was a very important factor on the cooling side, and working well with in terms of performing in gaming, but also performing in productivity workloads. That's where we ended up with the 120 watts TDP. So as you'll find when starting to test yourself, you'll see temperatures that be very, very reasonable, let's say compared to anything else out there on the high end, let's say the R9 7950X, for example. And that's basically because this CPU is the best of both worlds, right? And so you don't need to go all the way up to 170 watts TDP.
Per finire, quindi, abbiamo la prima generazione di Ryzen 3D sbloccati. Ho chiesto praticamente in che modo potessimo interagire nel BIOS e cosa effettivamente potessimo andare a toccare all'interno del BIOS per poter appunto tirare fuori il massimo delle prestazioni dal nostro processore AMD.
I think that's a good question. So let me first start off with how, as a user, you would upgrade to Ryzen 7000 with X3D, right?
Yes.
So yourself, you're using a Ryzen 9 7950X today. For any user that's currently on the AM5 platform, we recommend to check out your motherboard product page to make sure that you have the latest BIOS on a USB drive, for example. Any AM5 motherboard that's available today will support BIOS flashback, so you can basically flash the BIOS with a USB drive without the CPU installed, without memory installed, just to make sure that you have the right version. And I believe for Ryzen 7000 with 3D V-Cache, you'll find BIOSes with a Giza 1005C, mostly being posted by the motherboard manufacturer. So make sure that you grab one of those when you start installing the CPU. Once you've updated the BIOS, simply install the CPU, install your cooler back, obviously, and you're ready to go. Then the options that you have in the BIOS, there are certain, obviously when flashing the BIOS, we always recommend loading optimized defaults, making sure that all the settings are correct, and enable Expo if your DDR5 kit supports Expo for the best performance of your RAM. And then what is new with the Ryzen 7000 X3D over the previous Ryzen 7 5800 X3D, for example, is this time you have PBO support, but also curve optimizer support. And while it's not fully unlocked in terms of manual adjustments of the multiplier, like our Ryzen 7000X or Ryzen 7000 65-watt models, you do get a lot more headroom to play and to, if you have a, let's say, a over-spec cooler like a 240, 280, or even a 360 millimeter AIO, for example, or custom water cooling, you do have the opportunity to play around a little bit with the CPU, use PBO, use curve optimizer to, tweak fine adjustments. And you can spend days on it, right? As you're probably aware
Yes.
as well. It's analyzing the data, seeing, Cinebench runs, and then seeing, hey, I can do with a little bit lower voltage, I get higher boost clocks, right? Because sometimes that results in a higher boost clock. And so that's really the area where you can get to have some fun and play around, I would say, and potentially unlock more performance as well. And that's really the new benefits of 7000 X3D over the previous Ryzen 7 5800 X3D.
Ovviamente la domandina scomoda è: vedremo la 3D cache anche in ambiti che non sono processori? La mia domanda era giustamente appunto intesa sulle GPU, visto che comunque insomma vediamo che è un sistema che aiuta particolarmente i giochi sul processore, magari sulla scheda video potrebbe aiutare ulteriormente, quindi comunque ho cercato anche di spingere un pochettino da quel lato.
Well, actually, if you hold it like this, a GPU with a CPU on top, you have it, technically.
Okay. That's a good one.
No, to answer your question, unfortunately, I am just a product manager for the CPU desktop side of the house, so I cannot answer anything regarding GPUs. From a personal perspective, I would also love to see that, of course, but no, from a product perspective, I cannot comment on those products, unfortunately.
Okay, perfect. No, it's okay, it's okay. So thank you, Martin. You are so kind. You have a great
thank you.
You are a great knowledge. I think I can hear you for all the day and talk about 3D cache.
We should definitely chat some more, Gianmarco. I'm very much looking forward to our next meeting, and maybe in person as well. Maybe even in Italy, right? When I go on holiday. So
I'm near Rome. Rome is beautiful.
Good.
So come in Rome.
Absolutely. All right. Hey, thank you very much for your time. And again, if there's anything that we can follow up on offline, maybe some interesting data on Linux, for example, optimizations, as we mentioned before, we'll definitely make sure that you get some more information there as well, or at least what we can align on. And then, thanks a lot for your time. It's been great.
Thank you for your time. And now, like we say in Italy, when we want something a lot, when we really want a product, we say we have the monkey. Now
you have the monkey.
Now I have the monkey.
Thank you, Gianmarco.
Thank you so much, Martin. All right.
Cool. Looking forward to our next time.
Bye. Bye.
Ciao ciao.
Ciao ciao. Per finire, ragazzi, è stata una chiacchierata molto proficua. Devo dire che mi è piaciuto veramente tanto poter interagire con Martin, una persona che ha comunque una conoscenza enorme. È stata fondamentale la sua presenza in questo ambito, anche perché comunque chi meglio di lui può appunto descriverci i segreti della 3D cache. Sono stracuriosissimo di provare i processori. Comunque spero che me ne venga data l'opportunità anche di poterli provare, così possiamo vedere sul campo effettivamente questo tipo di performance. sapete benissimo che sono interessato all'ambito gaming, ma sono interessato anche ad altro. Ho fatto anche diverse domande per quanto riguarda l'ambiente Linux, ho dato anche il mio feedback per quanto riguarda quello dell'ambiente Linux, perché in questo momento sto utilizzando il 7950X come macchina principale e devo dire che gira veramente veramente bene. Sì, avevo detto che non avrei più cambiato computer, ho cambiato praticamente tutto, ma non il computer proprio in generale tutto, ma vedrete qualcosa nei prossimi video. E di conseguenza questo, ragazzi, diciamo che è una bella mezz'oretta di chiacchierata per quanto riguarda la 3D Cache. Spero che molti di voi abbiano appreso nozioni che non sapevano e come si riesce ad ottenere le performance da quella che al momento è la miglior CPU gaming. Ovviamente non vedo l'ora di poterla testare, non vedo l'ora di poter vedere effettivamente questo aumento di performance dove si trova e quello che fa. Ragazzi, cosa vi devo dire? Sono strafelice di aver riportato questo contenuto, stracontento, spero di poter ripetere esperienza, spero di avere occasione nuova di parlare con i ragazzi di AMD per quanto riguardano i prodotti. Molto interessante, sì è vero, la prova sul campo del prodotto per vedere effettivamente come va, eccetera, però è sicuramente anche molto importante sapere cosa c'è dietro per essere più consapevoli di quello che andiamo a comprare e di cosa effettivamente andiamo a migliorare. In questo momento, diciamo, fortunatamente sono anche tutti molto chiari per quanto riguarda diciamo i loro prodotti, tranne qualcuno che quando gli viene fatta questa richiesta tende ad essere un pochettino più evasivo, però vabbè, staremo a vedere come andrà il futuro. Detto questo, ragazzi, mi raccomando, fatemi sapere voi cosa ne pensate, commentate, condividete e noi ci vediamo al prossimo video. Ciao.